The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace as Margaret Torres adjusted her Royal Guard uniform for what she thought would be another ordinary day. She had served the British royal family for 7 years, standing motionless for hours, her face showing no emotion while tourists snapped photographs. Margaret took pride in her work, believing that protecting the monarchy was the highest honor anyone could achieve. That Tuesday started like any other. Margaret arrived at the palace gates at dawn, passed through security checks, and took her position near the east wing. The corridors were quiet except for the soft footsteps of palace staff preparing for the day ahead. Queen Camilla had a light schedule, with only a private afternoon appointment listed in the official records. Around noon, Margaret noticed unusual activity near the Queen's private chambers. Staff members were carrying wrapped packages and speaking in hushed voices. This was not completely uncommon, as the royal family often received gifts and had private meetings. However, something felt different today. The atmosphere carried a sense of secrecy that made Margaret's instincts sharpen. During her afternoon break, Margaret overheard 2 senior staff members discussing something about valuables being moved. They mentioned Queen Camilla's name several times, along with words like private sale and auction house representatives. Margaret's curiosity grew stronger. Why would the Queen be selling anything privately? The royal family had proper channels for disposing of items, all carefully documented and approved. When Margaret returned to her post, she noticed a black luxury car parked in the private courtyard. 3 well-dressed individuals emerged, carrying leather briefcases. They were escorted directly to a rarely used meeting room on the 2nd floor. Margaret recognized the room as one reserved for the most confidential palace business. Hours passed slowly. Margaret remained at her post, her mind racing with questions. The royal family's financial affairs were supposed to be transparent, especially after various scandals over the years. Any private sales of royal property would need proper authorization and documentation. Something about this situation did not sit right with her. As evening approached, Margaret saw palace staff carrying several items wrapped in velvet cloth toward the meeting room. Her heart began to pound when she caught a glimpse of something glittering beneath one of the cloths. It looked remarkably like the ceremonial crown Queen Camilla wore during special occasions. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Surely the Queen would not be selling crown jewels in a private transaction. Margaret knew she faced a critical decision. Her duty was to protect the royal family and their property. But what if that protection meant stopping something inappropriate from happening inside the palace walls? She thought about her training, her oath, and the trust placed in her. Royal guards were not supposed to question their superiors or interfere in royal business. They were meant to be silent protectors, not investigators. The meeting room door opened briefly and Margaret heard laughter and the clinking of glasses. Through the gap, she saw Queen Camilla herself, wearing an elegant dress and speaking animatedly with the visitors. The Queen looked relaxed and happy, which only deepened Margaret's confusion. If this was legitimate business, why all the secrecy? Why not use official channels? Margaret's shift was supposed to end at 8 o'clock, but she requested permission to work overtime. Her supervisor agreed without asking questions, assuming she needed the extra pay. In reality, Margaret wanted to see how this mysterious meeting would conclude. She positioned herself near the corridor that led to the meeting room, maintaining her professional stance while keeping her eyes and ears alert. Around 9 o'clock, the meeting room door opened fully. Palace staff began carrying items out, still wrapped in velvet cloth. Margaret counted 6 packages in total, each carefully handled. The visitors from the black car followed, carrying their briefcases, which now appeared heavier. Queen Camilla walked with them, speaking in low tones that Margaret could not hear clearly. As the group passed near Margaret's position, one of the velvet cloths slipped slightly. Margaret's suspicions were confirmed. Beneath the fabric, she saw the unmistakable sparkle of diamonds and the golden gleam of the ceremonial crown. Her stomach tightened. This was not some minor piece of jewelry. This was a crown that belonged to the British people, a symbol of national heritage. Margaret faced an impossible choice. Confronting the Queen directly would be career suicide and possibly illegal. Reporting her suspicions through official channels might take too long, allowing the crown to disappear. Doing nothing would make her complicit in what appeared to be an unauthorized sale of royal property. Her mind raced through scenarios, each more complicated than the last. The group moved toward the private exit. Margaret knew this was her last chance to act. Every fiber of her training told her to remain still, to trust the system, to believe that the Queen knew what she was doing. But another voice, the one that had driven her to serve her country in the first place, told her that some rules existed above personal career concerns. Margaret made her decision. She stepped forward from her post, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. Her voice, trained to project authority, rang out clearly in the corridor. She asked the group to stop, stating that she needed to verify the contents of the packages before they left the palace grounds. The looks of shock on everyone's faces, especially Queen Camilla's, would stay with Margaret forever. She had just challenged the Queen of England. The corridor fell silent. Queen Camilla turned slowly, her expression transforming from pleasant conversation to icy disapproval. The three visitors stopped mid-step, their faces showing confusion and alarm. Palace staff members froze, uncertain whether to intervene or retreat. Margaret stood her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to apologize and step back to her post. Queen Camilla spoke first, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of royal authority. She asked Margaret to explain herself, reminding her that royal guards did not question the movements of the royal family. The Queen's tone was not angry but carried a dangerous edge that made clear how serious this breach of protocol was. Margaret felt sweat forming on her forehead despite the cool palace air. Margaret chose her words carefully. She explained that palace security protocols required verification of all valuable items leaving the premises, regardless of who authorized their removal. This was technically true, though such rules typically applied to suspected theft, not royal business. Margaret knew she was stretching the regulations, but she could not think of another justification for her actions. One of the visitors, a distinguished man in his 60s, stepped forward. He introduced himself as Thomas Whitmore, a private antiquities dealer with 40 years of experience. He pulled documents from his briefcase stating that everything was completely legal and approved. Thomas seemed more annoyed than concerned, clearly viewing Margaret as a low-level employee overstepping her authority. Margaret requested to see the authorization papers. Thomas hesitated, looking to Queen Camilla for guidance. The Queen's expression had grown darker. She stated firmly that Margaret was out of line and would face disciplinary action for this insubordination. However, something in the Queen's reaction struck Margaret as defensive rather than righteously indignant. A truly innocent person would likely have been more bewildered than angry. The head of palace security, Robert Hayes, arrived within minutes, summoned by a staff member. Robert was a former military officer who ran security operations with precision and no-nonsense efficiency. He took in the scene quickly, his experienced eyes moving from Margaret to the Queen to the wrapped packages. Robert asked Margaret to explain the situation, his tone neutral but his posture suggesting he was preparing for something serious. Margaret explained what she had observed throughout the day. The secretive meeting, the wrapped valuable items, the private visitors, and most importantly, her glimpse of what appeared to be crown jewels being prepared for removal from the palace. She acknowledged that she might be wrong, but felt her duty required her to verify the situation before allowing potentially irreplaceable historical artifacts to leave royal custody. Robert turned to Queen Camilla and respectfully requested to see the authorization documents for the removal of royal property. The Queen's face reddened. She stated that as Queen, she did not need to justify her actions to security staff. However, Robert remained calm, explaining that recent reforms required documentation for all movements of items from the royal collection, even those initiated by the royal family themselves. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Thomas Whitmore began showing signs of nervousness, checking his watch repeatedly and suggesting they continue this discussion another time. His two associates started slowly backing toward the exit. This reaction only strengthened Margaret's suspicions. Legitimate dealers would have had paperwork ready and would welcome verification of their transactions. Legality. Queen Camilla finally admitted that the proper authorization forms had not been completed yet. She explained that this was a private sale of personal items that happened to include some ceremonial pieces. The Queen insisted these items belonged to her personally, not to the state, and therefore did not require the same level of documentation. This explanation raised more questions than it answered. Robert asked to examine the wrapped packages. Queen Camilla refused, stating this was an invasion of her privacy. The standoff continued with neither side willing to back down. Palace staff members whispered among themselves, clearly uncomfortable witnessing such a confrontation. Margaret began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake that would end her career and possibly result in legal action against her. A senior palace official named Victoria Ashford arrived, drawn by the growing commotion. Victoria had served the royal household for 30 years and knew every rule, tradition, and legal requirement governing palace operations. She listened to both sides of the dispute, her expression remaining carefully neutral. Then she made a statement that changed everything. Victoria explained that a recent audit of the royal collection had identified some items as missing from their designated locations. The audit was confidential and still ongoing, but several valuable pieces could not be accounted for. This information had been shared only with senior palace officials and was not yet public knowledge. Victoria's announcement created shockwaves through the group. Thomas Whitmore's face went pale. He immediately began insisting that his business was completely legitimate, that he had no knowledge of any missing items, and that Queen Camilla had assured him everything was proper. He demanded to see the items in question immediately to verify they were not part of any audit discrepancy. His panic suggested he feared being implicated in something criminal. Queen Camilla's composure finally cracked. She admitted that some of the items being sold were from the royal collection, but insisted she had the right to sell them for personal financial reasons. The Queen revealed that she had significant debts related to property renovations and had decided to quietly sell some lesser-known pieces to raise funds without creating a public scandal. This confession created chaos. Palace officials began speaking over each other. Victoria Ashford firmly stated that Queen Camilla did not have the legal right to sell items from the royal collection for personal gain, regardless of her financial situation. Such actions could constitute theft of state property. The severity of the situation was becoming clear to everyone present. Robert Hayes took control of the situation. He ordered the packages to be unsealed immediately for verification. He also requested that Thomas Whitmore and his associates remain at the palace until everything could be sorted out. Security personnel appeared at both ends of the corridor, ensuring no one could leave. Margaret realized that her simple act of questioning had uncovered something far more serious than she had imagined. As the velvet cloths were removed, the full extent of the situation became visible. Among the items were indeed Queen Camilla's ceremonial crown, several historic necklaces, a set of royal brooches, and other pieces dating back generations. Victoria Ashford examined each item against a digital inventory on her tablet. Her expression grew grimmer with each piece she verified. Nearly everything in the packages was listed as part of the protected royal collection. Queen Camilla sat down heavily on a nearby chair, her regal bearing completely gone. She looked tired and defeated. In a quiet voice, she explained that the financial pressures of maintaining her position had become overwhelming. She had believed that selling a few items quietly would solve her problems without anyone knowing. The Queen had not intended to steal, she claimed, but had convinced herself that she had more ownership rights than she actually possessed. The revelation sent shockwaves through the palace corridors. Victoria Ashford immediately began making phone calls to senior advisors and legal experts. Robert Hayes instructed his security team to secure the area and ensure complete discretion. Margaret stood quietly, processing the magnitude of what she had uncovered. A simple observation during her guard duty had prevented what could have been a catastrophic scandal for the British monarchy. Thomas Whitmore and his associates were escorted to a private waiting room. They were not under arrest, but they could not leave until investigators determined their level of involvement. Thomas kept protesting his innocence, insisting he had conducted proper due diligence and had no reason to suspect anything improper. His business reputation was now at stake, and the panic in his voice was evident. Within an hour, the palace had assembled a crisis management team. Senior advisors arrived through private entrances, their faces grim. Legal experts carried thick folders of documents outlining royal property laws and regulations. Everyone understood the delicate nature of the situation. If news leaked that Queen Camilla had attempted to sell crown jewels illegally, The resulting scandal could damage the monarchy's reputation for generations. Margaret was asked to provide a detailed statement about everything she had observed. An investigator named Sarah Chen led the interview, taking notes on every detail from the morning's unusual activities to the moment Margaret challenged the Queen. Sarah was thorough, but not accusatory, recognizing that Margaret had potentially saved the palace from disaster rather than caused the problem. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla remained in the corridor, surrounded by advisors who spoke to her in urgent whispers. The Queen appeared genuinely shocked by the legal implications of her actions. She had apparently convinced herself that her position gave her more autonomy over royal property than actually existed. The financial pressures she mentioned were real, but her solution had been dangerously misguided. The investigation quickly expanded. Victoria Ashford began checking the royal collection inventory against physical items in storage. The audit team discovered that this was not the first time items had gone missing. Over the past 18 months, nearly 20 pieces had been temporarily removed from the collection, though most had been returned. The pattern suggested that Queen Camilla had been gradually selecting items to sell, testing which pieces might be noticed. Financial records were examined with Queen Camilla's reluctant permission. The investigation revealed extensive personal debts related to property renovations, luxury purchases, and lifestyle maintenance costs that exceeded her official allowances. The Queen had been living beyond her means for years, using credit and personal loans to maintain appearances. The debts had reached a point where normal repayment seemed impossible. Thomas Whitmore was interviewed separately. He produced contracts and correspondence showing that Queen Camilla had contacted him 6 months earlier about selling personal items. She had assured him everything was legitimately hers to sell. Thomas had accepted her word, reasoning that a queen would obviously know what she owned. He admitted he should have requested more documentation but had been blinded by the prestigious nature of the transaction. The investigation uncovered that Queen Camilla had researched the black market value of various royal items. Internet searches on her personal computer showed visits to auction sites and private dealer websites. She had carefully studied which pieces might be sold without immediate detection. The premeditation made her actions appear more serious than a simple misunderstanding about property rights. As midnight approached, the crisis team faced difficult decisions. Criminal charges against a sitting queen were theoretically possible, but would create constitutional chaos. The royal family's reputation would suffer immensely from public knowledge of the attempted sale. Yet covering up the incident completely would be ethically wrong and legally questionable. They needed a solution that addressed the wrongdoing while protecting the institution of the monarchy. Margaret was allowed to go home around 1 in the morning, though she was instructed to tell no one about the evening's events. She signed confidentiality agreements and was informed that violating them would result in serious legal consequences. As she walked to her car, Margaret felt emotionally exhausted. She had done what she believed was right, but the consequences were far beyond anything she had anticipated. The next morning, Margaret arrived at work expecting to be reassigned or possibly suspended. Instead, she was called to Robert Hayes's office. He explained that senior palace officials had reviewed her actions and concluded she had performed her duty correctly. Margaret had followed proper security protocols in questioning the removal of valuable items. Her vigilance had prevented a catastrophe that would have harmed both the royal family and the nation. However, Robert explained that the situation remained extremely delicate. Queen Camilla was cooperating fully with the internal investigation, but was deeply embarrassed and angry about being challenged by a guard. The Queen had specifically requested that Margaret be transferred to a different assignment, far from the royal family's daily activities. While this was not a punishment, it was a political necessity to avoid ongoing tension. Margaret accepted the transfer without complaint. She was reassigned to the Tower of London, actually a promotion in terms of responsibility and pay. The historic site required experienced guards who understood the importance of protecting national treasures. Margaret's actions at Buckingham Palace had demonstrated exactly that understanding, making her ideal for the position. Meanwhile, the crisis team continued working on containing the scandal. They drafted multiple scenarios for how to address the situation publicly, if information leaked. The preferred option was describing it as a misunderstanding about personal property versus state property. with Queen Camilla making an honest mistake about what she could sell. This narrative minimized criminality while acknowledging that errors had occurred. Thomas Whitmore was released after investigators concluded he had acted in good faith based on information provided by Queen Camilla. However, he was required to sign agreements stating he would never discuss the incident publicly. His reputation had been damaged by association with the scandal, and he was eager to put the entire situation behind him. The other dealers involved received similar treatment. The palace decided to accelerate the comprehensive audit of the royal collection. Every item would be photographed, catalogued, and tracked with modern technology to prevent future discrepancies. New protocols were established requiring multiple authorizations before any item could be removed from royal properties. These changes were presented as modernization efforts rather than responses to Queen Camilla's actions. Queen Camilla's financial situation required immediate attention. Palace advisors worked with financial experts to restructure her debts through legitimate means. Some properties were quietly sold through proper channels, and budgets were adjusted to align with realistic income. The Queen agreed to financial counseling and accepted stricter oversight of her spending. These arrangements were kept private but legally documented. 3 weeks after the incident, a brief palace statement announced that Queen Camilla would be scaling back some public appearances due to health concerns. This was technically true, as the stress of the situation had affected her physically. The statement also mentioned ongoing modernization of royal collection management, but provided no specific details. Media outlets reported the news without suspicion, having no reason to connect these separate announcements. Margaret settled into her new position at the Tower of London. She found the work fascinating, surrounded by centuries of British history. Tourists asked her questions about the crown jewels on display, never knowing that she had recently prevented other crown jewels from disappearing into private hands. Margaret kept her secret, understanding that some truths were too dangerous to share. 6 months passed since the incident at Buckingham Palace. Margaret had successfully adapted to her role at the Tower of London, earning respect from colleagues and tourists alike. She maintained her professionalism and never spoke about what had happened that evening. The secret weighed on her sometimes, especially when she saw news coverage praising the royal family's integrity and transparency. She knew a different truth but understood why it had to remain hidden. However, secrets of this magnitude rarely stay buried forever. A palace staff member named David Morrison had witnessed part of the confrontation that night. David had signed confidentiality agreements like everyone else, but financial troubles led him to make a dangerous decision. He approached a tabloid journalist named Rachel Foster with hints about a major royal scandal, hoping to sell information for enough money to solve his problems. Rachel was an experienced investigative journalist who had exposed several minor royal scandals over her career. She recognized that David's vague hints suggested something significant. Rather than paying him immediately, she began her own investigation. Rachel started checking public records, interviewing former palace employees, and piecing together fragments of information. She knew that rushing the story could alert palace officials and result in legal action to suppress publication. Meanwhile, palace officials had their own concerns. An upcoming state visit from foreign dignitaries would involve displaying various items from the royal collection. During preparations, staff discovered that one of the items Queen Camilla had attempted to sell months earlier showed signs of having been replaced with a replica. This discovery suggested the situation was even more complicated than previously understood. Victoria Ashford led an emergency investigation into the replica. Analysis revealed it was a sophisticated copy that could fool casual observers but would not pass expert examination. The discovery raised disturbing questions. Had Queen Camilla already successfully sold the original and replaced it with a fake, or had someone else within the palace been involved in switching items? The investigation that everyone thought was concluded suddenly reopened with greater urgency. Investigators interviewed Queen Camilla again under more formal circumstances. She vehemently denied any knowledge of the replica. The Queen insisted that if a switch had occurred, someone else must have done it without her knowledge. However, her credibility had been damaged by the previous attempted sale. Investigators had to consider whether she was telling the truth or attempting to distance herself from deeper criminal activity. The investigation, expanded to include all palace staff who had access to the royal collection storage areas. Security footage was reviewed for the months leading up to the original incident. Investigators discovered that besides Queen Camilla, only 4 staff members had regular access to that particular storage vault. Each person was interviewed extensively, their financial records examined, and their activities tracked. Margaret received a call from Robert Hayes asking her to return to Buckingham Palace for further questioning. She traveled to London with growing anxiety, wondering if somehow she had become a suspect. Instead, investigators wanted her detailed observations from that evening. They were trying to establish a complete timeline of who had access to which items and when. Margaret provided everything she could remember, but months had passed and some details had faded. During her visit to the palace, Margaret encountered Queen Camilla in a corridor. It was the first time they had been near each other since that confrontational night. The Queen stopped, creating an awkward moment where neither woman knew quite what to say. Finally, Queen Camilla spoke quietly, acknowledging that Margaret had been correct to challenge her, and that the guards' actions had ultimately protected the monarchy from worse scandal. The brief conversation did not resolve everything between them, but it offered a small measure of closure. Rachel Foster's investigation was progressing. She had confirmed through multiple sources that something unusual had occurred at Buckingham Palace 6 months earlier, involving Queen Camilla and royal property. She still lacked specific details, but she had enough to approach the palace officially. Rachel submitted formal questions to the Royal Press Office, asking for comments on reports of an internal investigation into royal collection management and security. The Palace Press Office went into crisis mode. They had hoped the situation would remain permanently confidential. Rachel's questions proved that information was leaking, though she clearly did not have the complete story yet. Officials debated their options. Denying everything might work temporarily, but would make the situation worse if Rachel obtained more evidence. Providing a carefully crafted partial truth might satisfy her while controlling the narrative. The palace released a brief statement, acknowledging that during a routine audit, questions had arisen about proper protocols for royal collection management. The statement emphasized that no items had actually been stolen or permanently removed. It mentioned that internal procedures had been strengthened as a result. The statement was technically accurate while avoiding any mention of Queen Camilla's specific actions or the attempted private sale. Rachel recognized a carefully worded cover-up when she saw one. The statement confirmed something significant had happened but concealed the details. She intensified her investigation, knowing the real story was far more interesting than the palace was admitting. She began searching for palace staff who might be willing to talk, offering money and guarantees of anonymity. David Morrison contacted Rachel again, this time ready to provide specific details in exchange for payment. He was desperate enough to risk the legal consequences of breaking his confidentiality agreement. They met secretly in a London cafe, where David described what he had witnessed that night. He provided names including Margaret Torres, and described the confrontation between a royal guard and the Queen. Rachel could barely contain her excitement as she realized the magnitude of the story. Before publishing, Rachel attempted to contact Margaret directly. She found Margaret at the Tower of London and approached her during a break. Margaret immediately refused to comment, citing her confidentiality agreements. Rachel explained that she was going to publish the story regardless and offered Margaret the chance to provide her perspective. Margaret again declined but reported the contact to palace security immediately after Rachel left. The palace legal team swung into action. They obtained a preliminary injunction preventing publication on the grounds that the story contained confidential security information that could endanger royal family members. British courts took such matters seriously, giving the palace temporary protection. However, lawyers warned that a permanent injunction was unlikely. Eventually, some version of the story would become public. Palace officials decided to take control of the narrative before losing that ability. They arranged an exclusive interview with a trusted journalist from a major newspaper. In this interview, a senior palace official would describe the incident as a misunderstanding about royal property protocols that had been appropriately resolved through internal channels. The interview would praise the guard who raised concerns, though without naming Margaret, and emphasize the improvements made to collection management. The strategy partially worked. The authorized interview appeared first, presenting the palace's preferred version of events. When Rachel Foster's story appeared 2 days later with more dramatic details, many readers viewed it as sensationalized speculation building on the palace's official account. The tabloid nature of her publication also hurt her credibility compared to the establishment newspaper that ran the authorized interview. However, the story still damaged Queen Camilla's reputation. Public opinion divided between those who believed the palace's minimal account and those who suspected a more serious scandal had been covered up. Social media erupted with theories ranging from accurate speculation to complete fantasy. The palace's communication strategy had limited the damage but could not eliminate it entirely. Queen Camilla made a public appearance at a charity event, facing cameras and questions for the first time since the story broke. She maintained her composure, making a brief statement expressing regret for any confusion about collection protocols and praising the dedication of palace staff who ensured proper procedures were followed. She did not take questions, but her appearance projected confidence and normalcy. The media attention created intense pressure on everyone involved. Margaret found journalists camped outside her apartment and following her to work. She refused all interview requests, maintaining the silence required by her confidentiality agreements. The constant attention was exhausting and frightening. She had simply done her job, but now her life felt completely disrupted by forces beyond her control. David Morrison faced severe consequences for breaking his confidentiality agreement. The palace filed a lawsuit seeking substantial damages and criminal charges for theft of confidential information. David's defense lawyers argued he was a whistleblower exposing wrongdoing, but courts found his financial motivation undermined that claim. He faced potential imprisonment and financial ruin, becoming a cautionary example for other palace staff considering speaking to the media. The investigation into the replica item continued quietly, despite the public attention. Forensic analysis determined the fake had been created approximately 8 months before the original incident with Margaret. This timeline suggested a longer pattern of illegal activity than anyone had initially suspected. The original item had likely been sold long before Queen Camilla's attempted sale that Margaret had interrupted. Investigators focused on tracking the missing original piece through international art markets. They worked with law enforcement agencies across Europe and Asia, where such valuable items typically circulated among wealthy private collectors. The investigation remained classified, with even most palace staff unaware of its existence. Victoria Ashford coordinated with Interpol and specialized art crime units in multiple countries. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. An auction house in Switzerland contacted British authorities about an item offered for private sale that matched descriptions of stolen royal property. The seller was using intermediaries and false provenance documents, but auction house experts suspected authenticity issues with the paperwork. Swiss authorities arranged a controlled viewing that allowed British experts to examine the item remotely through detailed photographs. The item was confirmed as the original from the royal collection. Swiss police moved to seize it and detain the seller's representatives. However, the actual seller remained hidden behind layers of anonymous companies and legal entities. Tracing ownership through these complex structures would take months of international legal cooperation. The item was secured, but the person responsible for stealing it remained unknown. Queen Camilla voluntarily submitted to additional questioning when news of the Swiss recovery reached palace officials. She again denied any involvement with that particular item's disappearance. Her alibi for the relevant time period was verified through official schedules and security records. Unless she had accomplices, which seemed unlikely given her isolated actions in the later incident, she was probably telling the truth about this specific theft. The investigation began examining other palace insiders more carefully. The list of people with both access and opportunity was surprisingly short. Advanced security systems installed after previous scandals meant that nearly every movement within sensitive areas was recorded. Investigators reviewed months of footage, tracking who entered storage areas and when. The tedious work eventually identified suspicious patterns. A senior collections manager named Peter Hammond became the focus of investigation. Peter had worked at the palace for 15 years and was trusted implicitly by his superiors. However, security footage showed him accessing the vault containing the stolen item during unusual hours. Financial records revealed Peter had made several large purchases in recent years that exceeded his official salary. The evidence remained circumstantial but concerning. Confronted with the evidence, Peter initially denied everything. However, when investigators mentioned the Swiss seizure and explained that fingerprint analysis might connect him to the replaced item, he broke down. Peter confessed to having stolen and sold several items over the past 3 years. He had used his access and knowledge to target pieces that were rarely displayed or examined. The replica scheme had worked perfectly until increased scrutiny after Queen Camilla's incident exposed his activities. Peter's confession opened a much larger investigation. He admitted to selling 5 major pieces and replacing them with sophisticated forgeries. The total value exceeded £10 million. Peter had been motivated by gambling debts initially, but the easy success of his first theft had led to more ambitious crimes. He named the intermediaries he had used and provided details about the sales, giving investigators the information needed to attempt recovering the other stolen items. The revelation that a trusted employee had been systematically looting the royal collection for years created a new scandal. Palace officials debated how much to disclose publicly. The recovery of stolen items through international cooperation would eventually become public knowledge, making some disclosure necessary. However, they wanted to wait until more items were recovered and Peter's trial was concluded. Margaret learned about Peter Hammond's arrest through Robert Hayes, who felt she deserved to know the truth about the situation she had helped expose. Margaret felt vindicated knowing that her instincts about something being wrong at the palace had been correct. The situation had been even more serious than she realized, with Queen Camilla's attempted sale being just one part of a larger pattern of theft and deception. Queen Camilla's reputation improved slightly when Peter's arrest became public. Her actions, while still wrong, appeared less severe compared to Peter's systematic theft. Some commentators suggested the Queen had been a victim of the same lax security that allowed Peter to operate. The palace carefully encouraged this narrative without explicitly making such claims, allowing public perception to shift in a more favorable direction. Peter Hammond's trial began 9 months after his arrest. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of his crimes, including his own confession and recovered items. Peter's defense argued that inadequate palace security and oversight had enabled his actions, essentially blaming his employers for making theft too easy. The argument failed to generate much sympathy, and Peter was convicted on multiple counts of theft and fraud. The trial attracted international media attention, with reporters from around the world covering the proceedings. Details emerged about the sophisticated forgery operation Peter had used, involving criminal networks across Europe. The trial exposed how vulnerable even supposedly secure royal collections were to insider threats. Museums and institutions worldwide took note, reviewing their own security protocols. Peter received a substantial prison sentence, though less than the maximum possible. The judge acknowledged his cooperation in recovering stolen items and his lack of prior criminal history. Still, the sentence sent a clear message that betraying national trust for personal gain carried serious consequences. Peter's family released a statement apologizing to the royal family and the British people for his actions. The palace used the trial's conclusion to announce comprehensive security reforms. New systems would use advanced technology to track every item in the royal collection continuously. Multiple authorizations would be required for any access to storage areas. Independent audits would occur quarterly rather than annually. The reforms cost millions of pounds but were presented as necessary investments in protecting national heritage. Margaret received official recognition for her role in uncovering the problems, though the palace was careful not to make her too prominent in public narratives. She was promoted and received a commendation for exceptional service. More importantly to Margaret, she was reassured that her actions had been completely appropriate and had protected both the monarchy and the nation's heritage from serious harm. Queen Camilla made a formal statement accepting responsibility for her poor judgment in the earlier attempted sale. She acknowledged that financial pressures had led her to make decisions that violated both law and trust. The Queen announced she was establishing a scholarship fund using her personal money to support young people interested in careers protecting cultural heritage. The gesture was seen as appropriate atonement for her actions. 3 of the 5 items stolen by Peter Hammond were successfully recovered through international cooperation. The other 2 remained missing, likely in private collections whose owners were unaware of their illicit origin. Investigators continued working on those cases, hopeful that eventually all stolen pieces would be returned. The recovered items underwent extensive authentication and restoration before returning to the royal collection. 2 years after the incident that changed everything, Margaret Torres stood in her new office at Buckingham Palace. She had been promoted to Deputy Head of Royal Collection Security, a position created as part of the comprehensive reforms following the scandals. Her journey from a guard who challenged a queen to a senior palace official was remarkable. Though the path had been difficult and sometimes lonely, the palace had transformed its approach to collection management and security. Every item now had digital tracking using advanced technology. Regular audits occurred with military precision. Multiple authorization levels prevented any single person from having too much access. The changes had cost substantial money and required retraining hundreds of staff members, but the investment was necessary to prevent future thefts and protect Britain's cultural heritage. Margaret's responsibilities included training new security personnel on proper protocols and the importance of questioning suspicious activities regardless of who was involved. She often told new recruits, without revealing her own story completely, that their duty to protect national treasures sometimes required courage beyond physical bravery. It meant standing up for what was right even when facing powerful people or risking personal consequences. Queen Camilla had largely recovered her public image through consistent charitable work and transparent financial management. She had followed through on her promise to fund scholarships for heritage protection careers. 20 young people each year now received full university funding to study museum security, art conservation, and cultural property law. The Queen personally met with scholarship recipients annually, using these occasions to speak about learning from mistakes and serving something larger than oneself. The relationship between Margaret and Queen Camilla remained complex. They encountered each other occasionally during official palace functions. Their interactions were always professional and courteous, but an underlying tension persisted. Both women had changed because of that confrontational evening. Margaret had learned that doing the right thing often came with unexpected costs. Queen Camilla had learned that privilege did not exempt anyone from rules designed to protect the common good. Peter Hammond served his prison sentence with good behavior and was eventually released after 4 years. He emerged a broken man whose reputation and career were permanently destroyed. Peter gave a single interview upon his release, expressing deep remorse for betraying the trust placed in him. He warned others that greed could corrupt anyone, and that the temporary gains from crime were never worth the permanent losses. He now worked in a warehouse, far removed from the art world that had once been his passion. The 2 remaining stolen items were recovered through persistence and international cooperation. One was found in a private collection in Dubai, where the wealthy owner had purchased it without knowing its true origin. The owner cooperated fully once informed and expressed horror at having unknowingly possessed stolen property. The final item was recovered from a Tokyo collector who had suspected something wrong but had been too afraid of legal consequences to come forward. With all 5 pieces returned, the royal collection was whole again. Victoria Ashford retired after ensuring all reforms were successfully implemented. Her final act was publishing a detailed report on the entire scandal, with names redacted as a case study for other institutions managing valuable collections. The report was used in training programs worldwide, helping museums and cultural organizations learn from the palace's painful experience. Victoria's professional reputation grew even stronger in retirement, with institutions regularly consulting her expertise. David Morrison, who had broken his confidentiality agreement to sell information to the press, faced both criminal and civil consequences. He served a brief prison sentence and was ordered to pay substantial damages to the palace. More damaging was his destroyed reputation, which made finding any employment difficult. He became a cautionary tale about the consequences of betraying trust for money. His wife divorced him during his imprisonment, and he lost contact with his children, paying a far higher price than he had ever imagined. Rachel Foster, the journalist who had pursued the story aggressively, won several awards for her reporting. Despite the palace's attempts to control the narrative, her career flourished as she became known for fearless investigative journalism. However, she privately acknowledged that the story had been messier than she initially understood. Her reporting had focused on Queen Camilla's attempted sale, but had largely missed the larger story of Peter Hammond's systematic theft. She had gotten the scandal, but not the complete truth. The public's perception of the entire affair eventually settled into a nuanced understanding. Most people recognized that Queen Camilla had made serious errors in judgment, but had not been the primary criminal in the situation. Peter Hammond was viewed as the real villain, who had exploited his position for personal gain. Margaret was seen by many as a hero who had done her duty despite enormous pressure. The story became part of modern royal history, studied alongside other scandals and reforms. Margaret sometimes reflected on how a single decision during one shift had changed the course of her life. If she had remained silent that evening, Peter Hammond might have continued stealing for years and Queen Camilla's attempted sale might have succeeded. The long-term damage to the monarchy and the nation's cultural heritage would have been incalculable. Yet her decision to speak up had also been personally costly, creating stress, public attention, and career complications she had never wanted. She received letters from young people inspired by her story. Many expressed admiration for her courage in challenging authority to do what was right. Students studying criminal justice, museum management, and security careers cited her as a role example. Margaret found these letters both gratifying and uncomfortable. She had not acted seeking recognition, but simply trying to fulfill her duty as she understood it. The hero worship felt excessive for what she considered basic professional responsibility. The palace organized a special exhibition, celebrating the royal collections, history, and the importance of protecting cultural heritage. The exhibition included information about security measures and conservation efforts. While it did not explicitly mention the scandal, attentive visitors could recognize references to recent reforms and challenges. The exhibition was hugely popular, with thousands of visitors learning about the treasures under royal care and the complex work required to protect them. Queen Camilla attended the exhibition opening, giving a speech about the responsibility that came with being custodians of national heritage. She spoke movingly about how these items belonged not to the royal family personally, but to all British people and to history itself. The speech was widely praised as showing genuine understanding and humility. Whether that understanding came from sincere growth or skilled public relations coaching, the effect was positive for both the Queen and the monarchy. Margaret was invited to speak at a security conference about insider threats and the challenges of protecting valuable collections. She accepted nervously as public speaking was not her strength. However, her presentation was well received. She emphasized that effective security required creating cultures where staff felt empowered to report concerns without fear of retaliation. She argued that hierarchical organizations needed to be especially vigilant about ensuring that rank and privilege did not become shields for wrongdoing. The scholarship program Queen Camilla had established flourished beyond initial expectations. Many recipients went on to distinguished careers protecting cultural property around the world. They worked at museums, law enforcement agencies, international organizations, and universities. The program became one of Queen Camilla's most lasting positive legacies, tangibly benefiting heritage protection while serving as ongoing atonement for her past mistakes. Margaret eventually wrote a confidential memoir about her experiences, though it would remain sealed in palace archives for 50 years per agreement with palace officials. She wanted a complete and honest record to exist for future historians while respecting the privacy of living individuals. Writing the memoir provided emotional closure, allowing her to process the complex events and her feelings about them. The sealed memoir would eventually offer invaluable insights into how institutions handle internal crises. As Margaret looked out her office window at tourists gathering around the palace gates, she felt satisfaction knowing that the treasures inside were now better protected than ever. The reforms implemented after the scandal had made the royal collection one of the most secure in the world. Other institutions had adopted similar measures, raising standards globally. The painful experience had ultimately strengthened, rather than weakened, the system designed to protect cultural heritage. The incident that had begun with Margaret's simple observation during a routine shift had transformed multiple lives and institutions. It had exposed vulnerabilities, punished wrongdoing, implemented reforms, and ultimately made the protection of Britain's cultural treasures more robust. Margaret had paid personal costs for her vigilance, but she could look back knowing she had served her country well in ways that transcended her official duties. Years would pass before